record on this computer. There we go. Welcome back to Soil Carbon Conversations. This is part 3 of a 3-part series on the topic of soil carbon storage. Our first webinar was a discussion with several experts about the many benefits of regenerative grazing and soil carbon storage. In our second webinar, we talked about soil carbon measurements, certification, and carbon markets. And today we're going to talk about soil carbon storage in a corporate carbon footprint reduction portfolio. So we are going to start with just a few short bios and to introduce each of our panelists, and we'll jump into questions from there. We have about 45 minutes, but I will go about 5 to 10 minutes over time, just given the technical difficulties at the beginning today. So I'll just start there, and we definitely want to take time for your questions. Feel free to use the Q&A link to start adding your questions at any time. So first, I'd like to welcome Stacy Kauk. She is the director of Shopify's Sustainability Fund. Shopify is a leading global commerce company providing trusted tools to start, grow, market, and manage a retail business of any size. Prior to joining Shopify, Stacy was head of the Ozone Layer Protection Program at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Stacy worked on several chemicals management regulatory initiatives and represented Canada as a member of delegations for the Stockholm Convention and Montreal Protocol. Stacy began her career as a practicing environmental engineer. Second, we have Henk Mooiweer. He is the co-founder and CEO at Grassroots Carbon Public Benefit LLC. Grassroots Carbon offers an easy way to buy and sell nature-based certified carbon storage credits. In his 25-year career at Shell, he managed multiple complex business and innovation opportunities. As a Shell game changer, he took several disruptive innovations to implementation. Henk is also an adjunct professor at Rice University, where he teaches invention and innovation. He also holds a PhD in organic chemistry. And third, we have Kerry Harpole. Kerry is the manager of regulatory policy and sustainable practices at Marathon Oil. Marathon Oil Corporation is an independent oil and natural gas exploration and production company based in Houston, Texas. Kerry has a chemical engineering degree from UT Austin and an MBA from Rice. In her current role, Kerry is responsible for ESG strategy. In previous Marathon roles, she was responsible for sustainable water management at Marathon. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you for being with us today. I'm going to start with some key questions generally about CSR, corporate social responsibility, ESG, environmental social governance, and corporate carbon footprint reduction. Let's start with you, Stacy. So Shopify is a company that operates largely in the virtual space. How did Shopify identify its carbon footprint reduction needs, targets, and how difficult was it to set those targets?
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Kaitlyn, and really happy to be on this panel. And hopefully we'll see Kathy on here soon. But to start, yes, you're right. Shopify operates in a mostly virtual environment. We are a software company, so we're not, manufacturing a product. We don't have an overly complicated supply chain. So, we have a small carbon footprint relative to other industry sectors. And so we started by making sure that we had all of the data we needed to calculate our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And that allowed us to evaluate what would be an impactful corporate climate commitment. And so back in 2018, we pledged to be carbon neutral, and carbon neutral since we were founded in 2004. So we've actually gone back and retroactively calculated all of our corporate emissions, and we've taken responsibility for those by buying high quality offsets. Now, what happened when we were working through all of that and looking to buy a high quality carbon offset, we started to realize that you get what you pay for. And if you're buying a low priced offset, in many cases, you're not actually buying the climate benefit that is equal to what your company emitted into the atmosphere. So what we noticed was back in 2018, 2019, the quality of an offset that we wanted to buy was not readily available. And when I talk about a quality offset, I mean something that either captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or is capturing at the end of a flue stack at the end at a manufacturing facility where they're unable to do that without intervention. And then the other component of quality is the term of the storage. How long is that carbon dioxide actually locked away from the atmosphere in other parts of the carbon cycle? And what we noticed was what we wanted to buy wasn't readily available. And if it did exist, it was very expensive. So we started to realize that there was a market disruption that needed to happen. So we actually, alongside our corporate climate commitment, established a $5 million annual climate fund to support new and emerging solutions and technologies to reverse climate change. So that's how we're approaching it. And the difficulty we had was wanting to buy carbon credits that didn't quite exist yet.
Thank you for that. Let me switch over to Kerry for this question. So Marathon is different from Shopify in that it very much operates with a physical presence. For similar companies with an industrial footprint, making changes to the carbon footprint or setting and achieving targets can seem pretty daunting. So I just wanted to start with you of how Marathon got started in this process. What are Marathon's targets and how difficult was it to set targets as a company?
Hi, Kaitlyn. Well, first I will apologize because I have now used a stopgap being on my cell phone. So if I cut in and out, it's kind of, we're all working through the issues. Presence, we have a lot of technology and installations that are in the field. Things for us was to really understand what our emission profile was, where those emissions were coming from, and then to start to work out a roadmap or a plan on what we were going to do. We're populated by engineers, and so the data was very important for us to get our head around. And then we also corporately we initiated that's to participate in it, and also other multi-disciplines. We had law, we had all these groups there to kind of work as sort of an internal think tank on how we were going to go about this. Because our executives were very clear in saying that they wanted a concrete goal that was in a time frame that the people that were still here were going to need to execute in, and they wanted to know how we were going to get there, not a build it and they will come. So we established a 2025 goal for an emissions intensity. And what that basically means are emissions over, what we provide for those. And that goal is a 15.5 emissions intensity, which is roughly a 50% reduction from our 2019 baseline, which is what we were looking at when we kind of started the whole process.
Great, thank you for that overview. So as many of you know, this can be very complicated, right? To not only do the emissions inventory and decide on boundaries and that sort of thing, but then to get, as Kerry mentioned, the plan. What is the concrete plan to help guide us to those targets? So I appreciate that overview. Henk, let me just pop over to you for this. We know that Grassroots Carbon works with corporate sustainability teams, but you've been in this space for a very long time, including during your career at Shell. Have you seen any trends or changes in this industry generally around carbon storage and carbon offsets and such as you've been working to promote soil carbon storage?
Yes, Kaitlyn, thanks for having me here. Absolutely, we've seen a huge shift basically in the interest of companies. When we talked to companies about 2 years ago about soil carbon storage and how that could help them reduce their carbon footprint, we got strong interest. People were very enthusiastic and literally got the feedback from, wow, this is a fantastic solution and you're onto something very big, very exciting. And then it stopped most of the time. And we literally got a response back from why should we reduce our footprint right now? It's really not necessary. So come back to this later. That's what we got a lot of times. So strong interest, but no action. That changed tremendously the last 6 months. The conversations we now have about measured and independently certified soil carbon storage, you get the response from how many tons of carbon storage can you deliver this year? So it is a complete different scene. You can actually summarize it from shifting from interest to action.
Okay, so on that topic of shifting from targets to action, let's start with you, Kerry. What was challenging at Marathon to turn your targets into action? And what is it that you look for in solutions for carbon footprint reduction?
Well, one of the things in terms of turning the targets into actions is there was a big education process. Emissions are not terribly straightforward. So that is really a challenge that you have to get people to understand. I think a lot of people, I used to do water for a long time. You can see it, you can touch it, you can measure it. Whereas emissions, there's a lot of calculations that are involved. So we did have to do a large amount of education just all the way through our assets for them to understand. And so when we're looking for it, we are looking for two things, because there really are two factors people have to consider. One is what is going to an actual difference, and the other is also what's going to make a difference in your accounting methods, because that's how a lot of this stuff is done on a regulatory basis. It's based on models or accounting. Sometimes those two things don't necessarily match up. So that was important for us to be able to identify those projects, and also to focus on projects where you could get a lot of bang for your effort. You can look at a lot of little bitty things, but if they don't really add up to something substantive, you're kind of diluting your effort.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kerry. Stacy, what with your experience at Shopify, what did you experience as challenges, and what do you look for in potential carbon footprint reduction solutions?
That's a great question, because when I joined Shopify back at the beginning of 2020 to build out our climate fund and our corporate carbon footprint program, and I was told, well, you have $5 million to spend every year to support promising climate solutions and technologies. I was really excited. I'm like, wow, that's exciting. And I thought it wouldn't be difficult to spend $5 million, until I realized very quickly that the solutions that, we thought were going to be easy to find didn't exist. Or existed in research and existed in proof of concept facilities or pilot scale facilities. And so the biggest challenge was finding ways to get involved with these companies before they were necessarily commercially ready, and to be their first customer. And so what that meant was we couldn't have a traditional customer relationship where, okay, you're selling these carbon credits, great, we're going to buy them. We'd like to negotiate down that price. And, we ended up having to realize, well, if we're going to be a first customer, and if we're going to do that early so that these companies have that revenue stream that is so important when they're starting to commercialize and get into the market, that early revenue is what then allows other sources of capital to come in and support these companies. And so the biggest challenge for us was finding a way to make sure that we were getting involved with companies that were going to provide that climate benefit, but to do it in a flexible way that encourage them, if you are successful, we'll buy more. And to come up with a flexible approach that then encouraged the adoption of that climate solution.
Yeah, very, very insightful there. A lot of this is new, and it's sometimes hard, to stick your neck out and be the leader or be the first of anything. So I think that's a really interesting point too, in terms of organizational alignment. Henk, you've been interacting with many companies who are aiming to reduce their carbon emissions. Do you have anything to add in terms of additional general challenges that you've observed?
Yeah, so Kaitlyn, the challenges we see are really true. It is, of course, very difficult to reduce your carbon footprint, and we realize that. Quite often a company should work with a portfolio of solutions. There's not a single solution which works. But how do you build this portfolio? How do you build a robust, scalable, and affordable portfolio? That's hard. I think there's also one of the challenges, maybe there's a natural appeal for shiny technologies. Companies seem to trust that, especially when you're in the energy industry, when it's steel and it's a pipeline and a compressor, it sounds very good. And yes, that might work, but it's quite often extremely expensive and maybe not that scalable. And you quite often cannot handle scope 3 emissions, and emissions from your customers. So what now? Nature is quite often not that trusted. It seems to be like fragile and unknown, and how can you grab it? So that is a challenge. Basically the unfamiliarity of companies with what nature can do, despite the fact that nature works with carbon for hundreds of millions of years, it is hard to maybe get your hand around it. And then maybe a last challenge, what Stacy also mentioned early on, if you look at nature-based carbon offsets, there's a huge variety in quality, and you can buy cheap forest credits, and you can buy relatively high-priced carbon storage credits. So what is the difference? It is confusing. It requires you to do a lot of homework and preparation. So that is a challenge.
That education piece Kerry talked about, absolutely. So Henk, before we dive into this specific solution, could you just give us a really quick refresher of what soil carbon storage is and how regenerative ranching and American land managers fit into this solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first webinar, which I watched, there's a lot of experts telling the story there. But basically, if you look at the grasslands in the United States, they can store over 1 billion tons of CO2, atmospheric CO2, reliably every year, year after year, for decades and decades. So that's a huge chunk. That's almost 20% of the US greenhouse gas emissions. It's not only about carbon. If you actually do that, you also regenerate the grassland ecology with an enormous impact on birds, insects, wildlife, soil health, water absorption, erosion prevention, all these fantastic positive benefits. So it's way beyond carbon. And how you can do that is actually relatively fast. You don't have to start change how you use land. It's basically changing how you manage animals on land. If you start regenerative grazing or end grazing or holistic land management, where cattle moves around, mimicking the bison over the Great Plains, you get all these fantastic ecological benefits very fast, matter in a few years. And on top of that, you store a lot of carbon. So there's a lot of benefits there.
So Kerry, why did Marathon decide to use soil carbon storage as part of its carbon reduction portfolio specifically? Oh, and it looks like our connection might be cut with her. Let's start with Stacy right now. Why did Shopify decide to use soil carbon storage as part of its carbon reduction portfolio?
So when we set up our approach, we decided we didn't want to pick one kind of solution. We wanted, as Henk talked about, to develop a balanced portfolio. So within our sustainability fund at Shopify, we have 13 companies. Grassroots Carbon is one of them. And so we wanted to get involved with a variety of solutions. And there's a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to learn, because as Henk also mentioned, and I was talking about earlier, it's really important to understand what you're buying and what you're getting involved in. So one way to do that is to work alongside a variety of companies so that you can learn how they're approaching the solution, what goes into the monitoring and verification of those carbon credits. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to get into soil carbon, was because we saw that there was a need for people to provide support by saying, you know what, this is going to work. We believe in this solution. We may not have all the research and data necessarily at hand to confirm that, but in order to reverse climate change, we are going to need all the solutions. So soil carbon storage needed some support early on so that they can prove their concept, so that, you know, they can go out and do monitoring to back up the climate benefit. And then to go back to one of the points Henk made, it is about land use. Like, we are going to have to continue ranching, and We can't, replant forests across all of North America or worldwide. We don't have the land for that. We have to balance our land use split. So if we can continue ranching, do it differently, but also have a climate benefit, that really is an excellent solution.
Thank you. Kerry, if you're reconnected, we'd love to hear your perspective as well about why Marathon chose to include soil carbon storage in the portfolio.
Yes, so can y'all hear me?
We can,
Okay.
yay, it worked.
Yay!
Go ahead.
So for us, it was a lot of what Henk was saying resonated with us. Some of the technological solutions are very, very expensive, and they're also years and years to get implemented. We also looked at some of the offsets that were out there, but one of the things that we really liked was the ability that soil carbon or pulling it into the soil was sequestering actual CO2, as opposed to mitigating impacts of other ecological issues, forest destruction, those kind of things. So that was one of the pieces that we really liked about it. The other was the multiple environmental benefits that you got from it. You got improvement of your watershed, you had improvement of biodiversity, that were all things that were really great consequences of doing this, as opposed to maybe some unintended consequences that could happen from technology. And then I'm also an engineer, so the concept of removing things that are in the part per million type concentration levels out of the atmosphere is really a very, very difficult hurdle to get over. And the part about this that was amazing is that you effectively have a technology, because I would argue nature-based is technical too, it's just not made out of steel usually, that over millions of years it has been refined to pull carbon out of the air from a small concentration. So those things, and then as Stacy was saying, the fact that it's not really a land use change, it's a land modification change, or how you're using it, was also very appealing, because getting people to completely change what they're doing is very difficult.
So definitely it sounds like a lot of the co-benefits are appealing across the board with this a particular nature-based technology, we should start calling it. But real quickly, I know there are also concerns and challenges with this. So let's spend a minute or two on that. When you review nature-based carbon solutions, what are the concerns there? And then, how do you think this BCarbon certification might mitigate those? And then what is left over to tackle in terms of challenges? Start with you, Stacy.
Sure. So the BCarbon certification method was what really drew us in to soil carbon storage. And the reason that we like the approach is because it takes real in situ sampling at a statistically significant level and verifies the models. And the models are also done in a very conservative way. Henk will be able to dive into all the details on this, but we're quite confident that the carbon credits that we've purchased are in fact going to be verified by real monitoring using the BCarbon methodology. And we're not in a situation where what we bought actually wasn't stored. And we feel like the BCarbon approach is giving us that confidence. And so we're really looking forward to seeing the data get behind that methodology, because it could unlock significant growth, I think, in adoption and purchase of soil carbon storage.
Okay, so some of the concerns just being, will this really work, right? Just to put it very simply, will this actually work? And where's the data to back it up? So it sounds like the BCarbon certification method addressed those concerns for you. Were there any other concerns beyond that?
As a purchaser, of the soil carbon credits in something that, is emerging. It's an emerging, developing market. It's changed so much since we started to look at it. Early on, we definitely had a concern. Well, it's great we could buy a little bit now, but is adoption going to increase? Are ranchers going to make the changes that are required to increase the carbon that's stored in their soil? So we need the wheel to turn over, right? Like Shopify's buying these carbon credits, hoping that it's a signal that, if more are available, more will be bought. So we're hoping that that'll turn the wheel over and there'll be more ranchers adopting these practices to improve soil health, generate that additional income stream that we're willing to pay.
Interesting. Thank you. Kerry, over to you. What were your concerns when looking at this as a solution?
So they were very similar, but one of the things that, as an oil company that we're also very, very sensitive about is the perception of greenwashing. That we just threw some money at something and it didn't really do anything, and we're just trying to make ourselves look good. So we were very focused on wanting to make sure that where we invested our money, which it was an investment, because as Stacy notes that, it's kind of early on. And so we did kind of funding through the process, that it was something that was very, it was tested, it was verified, that there was a concreteness about that. And that's where the BCS process, you can follow it through. It's very scientifically sound. They go out, they do the field testing, all of those things. There's also the change management that comes along with what you're buying. They're going to have to go out and provide that support to ranchers, as opposed to just letting them kind of figure it out, because that's not going to be the most efficient way of doing this. And you need more and more people to latch on to this for this to become viable. And the thing we really liked about it was very scalable. As Henk points out, there's a lot of rangeland, grassland in the U.S., and so it is something that can absolutely be part of the overall solution, and we wanted to support that. But we also wanted to make sure that, if we bought a carbon certificate, that was going to be sequestered for a certain period of time, and then a year or two later, the rancher wasn't going to say, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. And so being able to, that's why we did focus on a US-based solution, because of the contracting and enforcement options that you have, as opposed to some of the other options that you have a more difficult structure just because of their legal system or their contract system.
Thank you for that, Kerry. Let's revisit corporate sustainability efforts more generally. I think, Kerry, you've been a leader in this space for many years, first with water and of course, and now with a much broader remit. Stacy, you're also a leader in this space. Technological solutions, and I think we've already touched on this to some extent, are usually a go-to, the steel, the concrete, et cetera. Kerry, what would you say to your peers in the industry in terms of encouraging the use of nature-based solutions as part of a portfolio for decarbonization?
Well, I think what's important for people to remember is we are all a carbon-based life form. Our planet functions on how it handles and manages carbon. It's gone on for millions and millions of years. So I guess for me, I do think it's a little bit arrogant to think that we're going to come up and have this, steel and structure solution that is going to be more elegant than what has been effectively designed over millions of years. The other thing is that in a lot of ways, the nature-based solutions, they have, as we discussed, other ancillary benefits, and they are less. I was fortunate enough to be able to go out and see one of the ranches that is utilizing this, and it was very eye-opening. But the other thing about it is it was beautiful out there. you didn't see giant pipelines, and you didn't see all of those things that also have to be maintained. And there's just a lot that goes with that. He moves his cows from pasture to pasture, actually moves them every day, which I was pretty amazed about. And they figured it out. And it's something that can be very, very effective. That also, the big technology solutions are very, very expensive. And so those are going to block certain people out, certain companies out. Whereas these are something that can be scaled for almost everyone. And as we continue to approach the climate change challenges, I think we need to have a much broader perspective in order to be able to have a really meaningful benefit or impact, especially on a shorter term.
I think it's sort of this conversation of it's about more than just the carbon, right? Going beyond that to all. Yeah, it's not just about the carbon. I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. Just that holistic picture of the different pieces of this coming together. Stacy, over to you. So what would you say to peers in your industry to give them, say, comfort in credits that are based on physical measurements rather than models? And I say that to you because, technology companies are famous for using a lot of modeling and pushing the envelope with new modeling methods. And it can be extremely helpful and useful. But this is actually a physically measured carbon credit. What are your thoughts on that?
The thing that makes this stand out, and it's really because it is a soil carbon credit. It's not just, if it's a forest-based, another nature-based credit, you're going out, you're counting trees, you're measuring trees. You can do that using technology quite often very effectively. When you think about soil carbon, I mean, all you can see is the top. You have no idea what's going on down below. And so you need those samples to confirm the carbon benefit. And the thing about using physical measurements, and I'm not sure how many folks on this call, I'm sure you're very familiar, like you can take a borehole in one spot and you could have a whole other game, 10, 25 feet away, just because of the nature of geology and the way things roll out. So because of that, potential for uncertainty when it comes to soil carbon storage, it's really important to have that physical measurement component rather than simply relying on models alone. I'm thinking over time as things develop and the data from this physical measurement process through the BCarbon standard starts to take hold, models will be able to be improved, right? And it's that connectivity between the two that has to be built out. And by buying soil carbon credits now, we're supporting that evolution to take place in this industry.
Henk, over to you. Anything else that we haven't addressed in terms of what companies should know about soil carbon storage as they're looking to build a decarbonization portfolio?
Yes, Kaitlyn, maybe a step back to nature-based credits in general. It's pretty easy to buy certified nature-based credits. I can probably do that now with a few mouse clicks, but there's a huge variety in quality. So keep that in mind. So companies have to do their homework, have to ask the right questions. Stacy also pointed to that. You can actually buy offset credits paying someone to not chop down a tree. It's almost a kind of a carbon hostage situation. If you don't pay me, I chop down the tree. You can buy offset credits where people actually plant trees in areas where there maybe should not be trees. So you get a very unsustainable forest, but it's also credit and certified. You can buy credits which are just modeled. And you have to trust that it all works out in the end of the day. Or there are credits actually which are measured and independently certified and verified and conservative. So be aware what you do. It's too bad. I wish it was easier, but you have to do your homework and have to ask these questions. Be very careful how you spend your dollars on just nature-based. And that, I think, also explains a lot of the criticism you see sometimes in the press about just offsets from nature-based. There's a huge variety and quality of these credits.
Okay. So to give you all a moment to have sort of a last word here, I'm going to ask the magic wand question. So if you had a magic wand which only works on soil carbon related topics, what would you change? Let's start with Stacy.
It's such a tough question to pick one thing, but actually hearing Kerry describe why Marathon's involved with soil carbon storage and why that's an important part of the strategy made me think in terms of recognizing that it's not just the carbon and that it is about the co-benefits of what you're supporting that's so important. And so if I had a magic wand that only worked on soil carbon, it would be that the purchases that companies like Shopify make, that financial piece flows through in a meaningful way to the ranchers, because those are the folks who are putting in the effort to change their approach, and they're the caretakers of that land and that space, and I think they should be appropriately compensated for it. So that's my wish.
Thanks, Stacy. Over to you, Kerry. What would be your wish?
I think getting a broader acceptance, just especially in the overall, environmental or NGO community, about the real impactfulness of this type of thing. I think there's a lot of focus on, I always look at it on two sides of the scale, right? And we need those sides of the scale to balance, whether it's just what's being emitted versus what's being sequestered, because we live in a bubble effectively. So there are so many benefits to it. And I think that a lot of groups are way too ready to dismiss it as, not being important or not meeting a particular agenda. But, for me, I'm all about outcomes. And the outcomes from this are absolutely fantastic. So if people can kind of get beyond their initial biases and really dig into it, I think they would find it something that really everyone should get behind. And then, to Stacy's point, as you can drive this down to the rancher level, which is what this does, it really promotes just overall a better land management, which is going to benefit everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kerry. Over to you, Henk, the magic wand question.
Yeah, so the magic wand, it's kind of similar, I think. I would try to remove the reluctance of a lot of companies to actually look at nature and start experimenting with nature and start a pilot project and do something so far beyond carbon with all these fantastic benefits. It's sometimes painful almost to see how companies, without a blink of their eyes, try to sign a check for billions of dollars to do something with technology, CCS, which is not that scalable. That amount of money would create so much change, so much fantastic change if you apply it to nature-based solutions. It will completely change what a huge chunk of America would look like. So open your eyes, and that's what I try to do with the magic wand. That would be wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, let's hop over to Q&A. We have a question from Mary. The question for Kerry and or Stacy would be, do you think you have made any mistakes in the process of building your carbon reduction portfolio, and how are you learning from these?
Well, I can kick off on that one. It's not a think, it's probably an I'm sure, because, as you're looking at things that are right now, it's very changing, it's very amorphous. And so it is a little bit of the game of whack-a-mole. So I'm sure as we look back 2-3 years from where we are now, we're going to go, oh, wow, I wish I had done this differently or that differently. But, the other thing is that you can't let fear of making a mistake or even what's a suboptimal solution, because I would say that, if you're doing some kind of good, that's not a mistake, but it may just not be optimal. That we'll look back on and say, I would do this different or that different. But if you don't start, you never get anywhere. So that's what I would encourage people to do, is really understand the landscape of where they are and then start digging in. But to Henk's point, you do really need to do your best to educate yourself, because it's tricky to filter through a lot of what's out there.
On my side of things, I can share. So we spent our first $5 million climate fund in 2020. We decided to go very broad. We picked 13 companies in 8 different areas. That's a lot. And so I know we're going to have some companies that succeed, and I'm sure we're going to have some that end up either not necessarily disproving their approach, but maybe the economics don't end up being viable from a business standpoint, and they may drop off. So what we're doing is we're trying to work with all of our companies to make sure that we're following along and understanding if they are having any challenges, how things are going, so that we can make sure year over year that if it's not working out and the performance isn't there, we're able to redirect our money into other companies that we're working with who are successful and are needing that additional support to continue to scale their solutions. So we fully expect things not to work out. And that's not a bad thing. Failure is the successful discovery of something that didn't work. And the big benefit of that is the faster you fail, the quicker you can get up and go do something that actually works. So that's how we're approaching this. And that's why we went wide. And I would think, looking back, one of the criticisms is very easily, well, you spread your fund very, very thin. What if you had picked 4 instead of 13 and given them all of the money? Then maybe things would be scaling faster. But because we were thinking we wanted to learn and identify which solutions were going to be successful, we wanted to go wide, but we did that because we recognized that we would likely have some failures along the way. And so we designed that into our process.
Really appreciate those answers. We are over time now, so I am going to wrap this up by just thanking you both profusely. Stacy, Kerry, sorry, both. I can only see 3 on my screen at a time. All 3 of you, Henk, Stacy, and Kerry, for being here with us today. And thanks to everyone for your patience while we were resolving some technical issues. Please do feel free to check out buildgrassroots.com to learn more about this specific solution, and get in touch if you want to learn more. So thank you very much. We will be, sorry, one more thing. We will be posting these on our YouTube page, the Global Affairs Associates YouTube page, if you want to get the replays. And as soon as this, which is the 3rd of 3, is done and up, we will be sending out an email to all registered attendees with the links, which is, I think, almost 300 across the 3 different webinars. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you, Stacy, Kerry, and Henk.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.